The quiet town of Pineville had always been known for its tree-lined streets and welcoming community, a place where people left their doors unlocked and knew the names of all their neighbors. It was to this apparent haven that Sarah Mitchell moved after accepting a position as a teacher at the local school, seeking a fresh start following the painful end of her marriage. The two-story house on Maple Street seemed perfect, spacious enough for her and her cat, Midnight, with a small backyard where she imagined planting flowers in the spring. Everything seemed ideal except for the house next door, a three-story Victorian structure with darkened windows and a deteriorated facade that contrasted dramatically with the well-maintained properties around it. Sarah noticed, on the very day she moved in, how local residents seemed to avoid looking directly at that house, as if the simple act of acknowledging its existence might attract some kind of unwanted attention. When she asked the real estate agent about the neighbors, he merely mumbled something about the house being empty for years and quickly changed the subject, a behavior that Sarah found strange, but attributed to the fatigue of a long day. During the first few weeks, Sarah adapted well to her new life. Her students were receptive, her colleagues friendly, and she began to establish a comfortable routine. However, as the autumn nights grew longer and colder, she began to notice disturbing things related to the neighboring house. Lights that flickered in supposedly empty rooms, shadows that seemed to move behind dusty curtains, and most unsettling, muffled sounds that seemed to come from the walls separating the two properties. Initially, Sarah tried to rationalize. Perhaps the house wasn't really empty, perhaps they were just old electrical problems, or perhaps the wind was causing those strange noises that woke her in the middle of the night. But then, her cat Midnight began to behave strangely, bristling and hissing at the shared wall, refusing to enter certain rooms in the house, especially those closest to the neighboring property. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of frantic scratching at her door. It was Midnight, terrified, with eyes dilated in fear, as if fleeing from something only he could see. That same night, Sarah was certain she heard the distinct sound of dragging footsteps on the floor above in the house next door, followed by a long and anguished moan that seemed more animal than human. Sarah's curiosity soon transformed into a disturbing obsession. She began researching the history of the neighboring house at the local library, discovering carefully archived old newspaper clippings that told a troubling story. The house had belonged to the Blackwood family for generations, until a series of unexplained deaths in the 1970s left the property abandoned. The last resident, Dr. Edward Blackwood, was a respected physician who supposedly conducted experiments in his basement, although the details were vague and contradictory. Records indicated that he had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only dark stains on the basement floor that investigators were never able to fully identify. Even more disturbing were reports from neighbors at the time who swore they had seen Dr. Blackwood in windows of the house weeks after his supposed disappearance, always watching, never speaking. As Sarah deepened her research, she began to notice a recurring figure in her own windows, a dark silhouette that seemed to be watching her from the house next door, visible only from the corner of her eye, disappearing whenever she tried to look directly. It was then that Sarah realized she wasn't just investigating the history of the Blackwood house. The house was somehow investigating her as well. Sarah's first month in her new house passed without major incidents, aside from the occasional feelings of discomfort that she attributed to adapting to a new environment. However, everything changed on a particularly cold October night when a violent storm hit Pineville. Lightning briefly illuminated the sky, casting distorted shadows through Sarah's window. During one of these flashes, she glimpsed something that made her blood freeze, a pale figure watching her from the second-floor window of the Blackwood house. It wasn't an indistinct silhouette this time, but a clearly visible face, sunken eyes in darkened orbits, sallow skin stretched over prominent bones, and a smile that extended unnaturally at the corners of the mouth. When thunder sounded seconds later, the figure had disappeared. Sarah remained paralyzed in her armchair, the book she had been reading forgotten in her lap, as she tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light or her overactive imagination. But but an unsettling certainty settled in her mind. Those eyes had not only seen her, they recognized her, as if they had been waiting for her for a long time. That night, Sarah locked all doors and windows, pushed a dresser against her bedroom door, and still couldn't sleep, hearing what seemed to be the sound of nails scratching the outer walls of her house. The following morning, determined not to let herself be dominated by fear, Sarah decided to talk to other neighbors about the Blackwood house. Her first stop was at Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins' house, a lady in her 70s who, according to the local mailman, had lived in the neighborhood forever. At first, Eleanor showed reluctance to speak on the subject, offering Sarah tea and cookies while skillfully deflecting her questions. It was only when Sarah mentioned having seen someone in the window that the elderly woman's expression changed drastically. "You've seen him then," Eleanor murmured, more as a statement than a question, her wrinkled fingers gripping the teacup so tightly that Sarah feared it might break. In a trembling voice, Eleanor told how, as a child, she used to play with Dr. Blackwood's daughter, Lily, a sweet girl who mysteriously fell ill at 12. According to Eleanor, Dr. Blackwood became obsessed with finding a cure, locking himself in the basement for days, emerging only to collect samples from local children, a strand of hair here, a drop of blood from a scraped knee there. When children began to disappear, residents formed a mob and invaded the house, only to find the basement empty except for strange symbols drawn on the floor and walls, and a metallic smell that no one could identify. "They never found the bodies," Eleanor whispered. "Not the doctors, not the children's, not little Lily's, but sometimes on nights like last night, when the storm stirs what should remain dormant, we can see them in the windows, watching, waiting." Disturbed by the conversation with Eleanor, Sarah spent the following days obsessively observing the Blackwood house, noting every anomaly in a notebook. Lights that flickered in sequences that seemed almost deliberate, shadows that moved against the wind, the strange behavior of birds, which completely avoided the branches of the tree that extended between the two properties. She installed a camera facing the neighboring house, hoping to capture some concrete evidence of what she was witnessing. On the third night, the camera stopped working without explanation, and when Sarah checked the recording, she found only static, except for a single frame where that same pale face seemed to be looking directly into the lens, much closer than would be possible from the Blackwood house window. Even more alarming was what Sarah discovered the next morning: muddy footprints in her garden leading from the Blackwood house to her living room window and then back. The footprints were small, like those of a child, but strangely deformed, as if whoever left them was walking in an unnatural way, almost dragging themselves. That same morning, Sarah found a small object on her welcome mat, an old cloth doll with black buttons in place of eyes and hair that seemed disturbingly real. Sewn into the doll's dress was a name: Lily. Sarah dropped the doll as if it were on fire, backing away until she hit the wall. It was then that she heard, coming clearly from inside her own house, the sound of a child's laugh, followed by light footsteps running up the stairs. After the incident with the doll, Sarah could no longer ignore that something deeply wrong was happening. She spent sleepless nights obsessively researching the history of the Blackwood house and similar paranormal phenomena. On an obscure forum dedicated to supernatural occurrences in small American towns, Sarah found a post from 10 years ago written by someone who identified themselves only as Survivor from Maple Street. The account detailed experiences frighteningly similar to hers: visions of pale figures in windows, objects that moved on their own, and the persistent sound of a child crying in the walls. The post's author claimed to have discovered a hidden diary in their attic, supposedly belonging to a nurse who worked with Dr. Blackwood. The diary described horrific experiments conducted in the basement, not just on voluntary patients, but eventually on the neighborhood children themselves, including his daughter Lily. According to the writings, Blackwood believed he had discovered a way to anchor the human soul to the physical plane after death, creating a kind of intermediate existence, neither alive nor completely dead. The experiments culminated in a final ritual on the night when residents invaded the house, a ritual that, according to the nurse, tore the veil between worlds. The post ended abruptly, with the author promising to share more discoveries the next day, but there was never an update. When Sarah tried to make contact through the forum, she discovered that the account had been deleted, and all efforts to track down the survivor led to dead ends. Determined to find concrete answers, Sarah decided to visit the one place she hadn't yet explored, the basement of her own house. The real estate agency had mentioned that the two houses, built in the same period, originally shared a heating system with maintenance tunnels connecting the basements. These tunnels had supposedly been sealed decades ago, but Sarah suspected there might still be some connection. Armed with a powerful flashlight and her cell phone, although she knew she probably wouldn't have a signal, she descended the creaking steps to the dark, damp basement. The smell of mold and decay was almost unbearable, but there was something else. A metallic odor reminiscent of blood, growing stronger as she approached the wall dividing the two properties. Carefully examining the peeling concrete, Sarah noticed a section that seemed newer than the rest, as if it had been repaired or replaced. When she knocked on it, the sound was hollow. Using an old rusty shovel she found leaning in a corner, Sarah began to strike the wall, feeling a mixture of terror and excitement when the concrete began to give way. After several minutes of frantic effort, a fist-sized hole formed and a cold, putrid air escaped from the space beyond. Pointing the flashlight through the opening, Sarah glimpsed what appeared to be a narrow tunnel, its walls covered with strange symbols painted in a darkened substance that she prayed wasn't blood. Even more disturbing was what her light caught on the tunnel floor. Small footprints in the dust, identical to those she had found in her garden, but these seemed fresh, as if someone or something had passed through recently. As Sarah contemplated whether she should widen the hole enough to pass through, a high-pitched, penetrating sound echoed through the tunnel. A child's cry, initially distant but rapidly approaching. Paralyzed by fear, Sarah watched in horror as small, pale, bony fingers appeared at the edge of the hole, followed by another set and another. The crying transformed into dissonant, childish laughter as more hands emerged, trying to widen the opening from the other side. In panic, Sarah backed away, stumbling on the basement stairs as she ran back to the upper floor. Locking the basement door behind her, she heard a deafening crash, as if the entire wall had collapsed. The laughter now seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, beneath the floorboards. Running to the phone, Sarah tried to call the police, but the line was dead. Her cell phone showed 0 signal bars, and when she tried to use Wi-Fi to send a distress message, she discovered that all electronic devices in the house had stopped working. Looking through the kitchen window, she saw that the entire street was dark, except for the Blackwood house, whose windows now glowed with a pulsating blue light. In the attic window, clearly visible against that unnatural light, was the silhouette of a tall, thin man wearing what appeared to be a stained lab coat. He raised his hand in a gesture of greeting, and all the lights in Sarah's house simultaneously turned on, revealing dozens of pale, deformed children scattered throughout the room, their black, empty eyes fixed on her, their mouths stretched into identical, impossible smiles. Sarah's instinct screamed for her to flee, but the spectral children blocked all possible exits. Their translucent bodies emitted a sickly blue glow, and Sarah noticed with horror that she could see through them. They weren't solid, but they weren't completely ethereal either. When one of the children approached, Sarah felt an intense cold that seemed to suck the heat from her body. The child, a girl with long dark hair and an antiquated dress, stretched her hand toward her. "He's waiting for you," she whispered in a voice that sounded like several children speaking in unison. "Daddy needs you to complete what he started." The other children began to chant in an unknown language, moving in a circle around Sarah, getting closer and closer. In a flash of desperate clarity, Sarah remembered something she had read during her research. Supernatural entities often couldn't cross salt barriers. Slowly backing toward the kitchen, she managed to reach a package of coarse salt in the cupboard. With frantic movements, she spread a thick line around herself, forming an improvised circle. The children abruptly stopped at the edge of the circle, their faces contorting into expressions of anger and frustration. The dark-haired girl, whom Sarah now suspected was Lily Blackwood, tilted her head at an impossible angle, observing her with morbid curiosity. "That won't protect you forever," said Lily, her voice now sounding only childish and strangely sad. "He always finds a way. He found a way through me." Temporarily protected by the salt circle, Sarah tried to comprehend what was happening. "Who is he? What does your father want with me?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the terror that threatened to consume her. Lily floated around the circle, her feet never touching the ground. "Daddy discovered how to trap souls in the world of the living," she explained, with the disturbing simplicity of a child discussing game rules. "But he needed a special host to complete the transition, someone with what he called sensitivity, someone like you." The other children murmured in agreement, their empty eyes fixed on Sarah. "We were all tests," continued Lily, "experiments to perfect the process, but none of us was strong enough to contain what he wanted to bring to this side." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she understood what Lily was implying. The missing children hadn't simply been murdered, they had been used in rituals, transformed into vessels for something that Dr. Blackwood was trying to manifest in the physical world. "What happened on the night when the residents invaded the house?" asked Sarah, desperate to understand. Lily's face contorted in an expression of pain. "Daddy knew they were coming. He said we needed to complete the ritual before they interrupted us. He used me last, said I was special, that I would be strong enough." Tears of a dark, viscous liquid began to stream down the girl's face. "But I wasn't. None of us was. And now we're trapped here, neither alive nor dead, waiting for him to find the perfect host." As Lily spoke, Sarah noticed that the salt circle was slowly disintegrating, as if an invisible force was pushing the grains away. Through the window, she saw that the light in the Blackwood house was pulsating more intensely, and the silhouette of the doctor now seemed to be moving, coming down the stairs, approaching. With a sudden snap, all doors and windows in Sarah's house opened simultaneously, allowing an unnatural, icy wind to invade the environment, completely dispersing the protective salt circle. The spectral children smiled in unison, moving apart to form a corridor leading to the front door, now wide open. On the threshold, materialized as if he had just crossed an invisible veil, stood Dr. Edward Blackwood. His body was solid, unlike the translucent children, but there was something deeply wrong with his appearance. His skin had a cadaverous pallor, his movements were rigid and artificial, and his eyes were completely black, like empty holes in his face. He smiled at Sarah, revealing sharpened, blackened teeth. "Finally," he said, in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, reverberating as if speaking from inside a deep tunnel. "You cannot imagine how long we've been waiting for someone like you, Sarah Mitchell." He extended a hand toward her, and Sarah felt her body begin to move involuntarily, as if pulled by invisible strings. "You will help us complete what we began 50 years ago. You will help us open the portal permanently." Dudin, as she was inexorably dragged toward the doctor, Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't being taken to her death. She was being taken to something much, much worse. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. The Pineville police conducted extensive searches, interviewed neighbors and scoured the area, but found no sign of the teacher. Her house remained intact, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. The only disturbing detail was the circle of salt found in the living room, partially dispersed as if by a current of air. The case soon went cold, with authorities concluding that Sarah had probably left town voluntarily, perhaps due to undisclosed personal problems. Only Eleanor Jenkins insisted that something terrible had happened, something related to the Blackwood house, but her concerns were dismissed as the delusions of an elderly lady. The school hired a substitute, neighbors went on with their lives, and gradually Sarah's absence became just another unsolved mystery in the small town's history. Nobody noticed the subtle changes that began to occur in the Blackwood house. The windows that seemed slightly cleaner, the lights that occasionally glowed in the middle of the night, the distant sound of a woman singing a lullaby. Nobody, except Jason Cooper, the new tenant who had just moved into Sarah's old house, attracted by the surprisingly low rent and the convenient location near the university where he would begin his doctorate in history. Jason noticed the anomalies almost immediately: the strange behavior of his dog, which refused to enter certain rooms, the the vivid and disturbing dreams about pale children calling him by name, the constant feeling of being watched. One night, while organizing his books, Jason found a notebook hidden behind a loose shelf. It was Sarah's research journal, detailing her discoveries about the Blackwood house and the strange events she had witnessed. The last pages were particularly disturbing, frantic notes about a ritual, a portal, and entities that existed between worlds. The final entry, dated the night of her disappearance, contained only one sentence. "He doesn't just want a host, he wants a bridge." Was intrigued and alarmed, Jason began his own investigation, delving into the city's historical archives and Dr. Blackwood's medical records that he managed to access through the university. What he discovered horrified him. Blackwood wasn't just an eccentric doctor, but an occultist, obsessed with the idea of opening a permanent portal between dimensions. His experiments with children were attempts to create conductors, hybrid beings that could exist simultaneously in multiple planes of reality. According to Blackwood's theories, a fully conscious adult conductor with certain psychic sensitivities could serve as a living anchor, allowing entities from another existential plane to freely cross into our world. On the third night after his discovery, Jason woke to the sound of someone softly knocking on his door. Still groggy from sleep, he opened the door without thinking, finding a woman standing in the dark hallway. For a moment, he didn't recognize her, then realized it was Sarah Mitchell, the former missing tenant. But there was something deeply wrong with her. Her skin had an unhealthy pallor, her movements were rigid and artificial, and her eyes were completely black, like those of the children in his dreams. "Hello, Jason," said Sarah in a voice that didn't seem entirely her own, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison through her. "We felt your interest in our work. Dr. Blackwood would like to invite you to join us." She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed to have been sharpened, and extended her hand. Behind her, Jason could now see, were the silhouettes of countless children, their translucent bodies emitting a blue glow that illuminated the hallway. And beyond them, on the threshold of the door connecting the two houses, a door that Jason was certain didn't exist before, stood the tall, imposing figure of Dr. Blackwood, his lab coat stained with substances that Jason didn't want to identify. "The bridge is almost complete," continued Sarah, her voice now mixed with Lily's and other children's. "We need just a few more conductors before they can cross completely." As she spoke, the reality around Jason seemed to distort, the walls of his house rippling as if made of thin fabric. Through these ripples, he briefly glimpsed another place, a vast, dark abyss where colossal and impossible forms moved, their contours defying human comprehension, and they were approaching, drawn by the light emanating from Sarah, by the bridge she had become. Jason Cooper's disappearance, just 3 weeks after moving into the house on Maple Street, barely caused a stir in Pineville. Some residents commented on the strange coincidence, 2 tenants disappearing from the same property in such a short time, but most simply shrugged, attributing the events to mere casualty. The real estate agency quickly put the house up for rent again, this time with an even greater discount, attracting the attention of a young family looking for a new beginning. The Parkers, Michael, his wife Emma, and their 5-year-old daughter Lily, were enchanted with the space and location, ignoring Eleanor Jenkins's veiled warnings about the bad luck associated with the property. They moved in on a sunny spring day, full of plans and hopes for the future, not noticing the attentive gazes watching them from the darkened windows of the Blackwood house. On the Parkers' first night in their new home, little Lily woke her parents, excited about her new friends, children who, according to her, lived in the walls and promised to show her secret places where adults couldn't go. Michael and Emma smiled indulgently, attributing the story to the imaginary friends common in children of that age, especially after a move. They didn't notice the subtle change in the Blackwood house, how the previously dusty windows now seemed cleaner, how the lights flickered in patterns that almost formed words, how the once dead garden began to bloom with strange-looking plants of unnatural colors. They didn't notice how, each day, more and more Pineville residents began to display the same empty eyes and artificial smiles, as if something was slowly taking control of the entire town. What no one in Pineville could comprehend comprehend was that the bridge that Sarah Mitchell had become was now complete, strengthened by the addition of Jason Cooper and ready to be expanded. Dr. Blackwood had finally achieved what he had sought for decades, not just a temporary portal between worlds, but a permanent and growing connection. The entities he had patiently served for so long were finally crossing over, using the bodies of residents as temporary vessels while adapting to our reality. And at the center of it all was the Blackwood house, no longer just a physical structure, but a nexus between dimensions, its interior now an impossible labyrinth of corridors that defied the laws of physics, leading to places that should never be accessed by the human mind. Little Lily Parker would be just the next in a long line of conductors, her innocence and sensitivity making her particularly valuable to the entity's plans. Meanwhile, in the depths of the abyss beyond the portal, something ancient and vast watched with infinite patience, knowing that soon, very soon, the veil between worlds would be too thin to contain its complete passage. And when that happened, the terror that began in the house next door would spread far beyond the limits of Pineville, consuming everything in its path with a hunger that transcended human comprehension.